We can start here in about a minute. This is probably all we have, and oh, now somebody's coughing. Hey, can't be any worse than obviously what's been going around the last few days. So, oh yeah, we're going to be in Chronicles, 1 Chronicles 12 and 13 tonight. Going to get started in just a few minutes, or half a minute here. So, we're all set? Okay. Let's go ahead and have a word of prayer, and then we'll begin. Our dear Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for your word. We thank you for the hope that we have because of what Christ has done for us, and how you have delivered to us the instructions through your prophets that might help us understand godliness and righteousness, and that we might learn to walk in your ways and not only be blessed, but also to bless others. And so we're thankful that we can gather tonight. And we do ask prayers for, many in our congregation who have become sick in the last couple days. We hope that you'll keep them in your care, and give us wisdom in understanding of your word, that we might learn the lessons contained within it that can help us to know you better and to know righteousness better. We thank you for all these blessings, especially Jesus. In his name we pray. Amen. Okay. So I wanted a couple things I'm going to point out. First off, I'm going to point out some maps here in a second. But we hit 10 and 11 last week. The very first week we just kind of skipped through all the genealogies of the first 9 chapters. And then it really quickly, goes into the death of Saul. So it skips over, his, kingdom very quickly, because his kingdom was removed. And so the focus of Chronicles is on the restoration of God's kingdom, not one that's, taken away. So there's very little focus there. But in chapter 11, we pointed out that we go from Saul and the death of Saul to David being anointed king over all of Israel, which is 7.5 years after he actually begins to rule as king for Judah. And so just skips it. And then it goes into David's move to Jerusalem, when he basically takes over all of Israel. You can just move it yourself unless you can get me to be able to use it. Okay. So Jerusalem here, Hebron's down here. Hebron is much more solidly in Judah. And Jerusalem is right on the edge of Benjamin's. In fact, Gibeah, I believe, is a city in Benjamin. So Benjamin is a slice that's just kind of right up near Jerusalem. And so Jerusalem's much more centered. Plus, it was a fortified city that they had been unable to take until David had already been ruling, as king for the 7.5 years. And so, it's probably the most fortified city in this area. And so he takes it, moves his kind of rule there. And then it lists all of, a bunch of David's mighty men and some of the things that they did. Well, we then come into chapter 12, and it continues to mention the mighty men. But if you don't, so I just read the first line here. Now, these are the men who came to David at Ziklag. But if you don't know that reference, you don't know that we just jumped back maybe 20 years, 30 years in time. Because Ziklag, these particular, I'm not going to read through all the notes and things, but these particular dots are the places where David fled to when Saul was trying to kill him. Okay? So it starts, here near Saul's, hometown, home area, in Gibeah, and then how he kind of, flees to Ramah, and then, he's kind of coming back, and he goes down to Bethlehem, and he comes back up, and, and then, on 6, he's here again. 7, it goes to Gath and Adullam. So Gath is in Philistines. Remember, he at times left for the Philistine area to get away from Saul's reach. But anyway, these are a lot of the places that he traveled to try and find security. Now, so I think it's the next map I have. Yeah, here's Ziklag. So these continue the numbers. So 17, 18 in Gath again. 19. So 19 here is where he's at Ziklag. And this is where this particular account of his mighty men come from. Now, there's something pretty interesting. I'm not going to focus a lot on all the different names here, but I do want to focus on a few, especially the early verses here, because these are pretty interesting. This is why I said, when you get lots of lists of names, it's really helpful, though, to still read through it. You can kind of skim it and see, well, is it giving any little information in there about them or about something? Because that's what we have here. We get a lot of lists of names, a lot of his mighty men, but what we find out is a bunch of his mighty men come from Saul's own tribe. And they come from Saul's own tribe when Saul was trying to kill him. And so even Saul's own men were not always on his side. And so we see actually there's a couple of interesting things, I think, in these couple of chapters that we don't always learn in other places. Some reflect on Saul. But it says, now these are the men who came to David at Ziklag while he could not move about freely because of Saul, the son of Kish. And they were among the mighty men who helped him in war. They were bowmen and could shoot arrows and sling stones with either the right hand or the left hand. They were Benjamites, Saul's kinsmen. The chief, and then he goes and starts listing a bunch of them. And then you even have in verse 4, Ishmael of Gibeon. So right from, near Gibeah. I don't know where Gibeon, actually I don't know how close Gibeon is to Gibeah, but you do have both sons of Shema of Gibeah. And then you have, so it goes through and starts listing a bunch of them. And then we have the Gadites in verse 8. They went over to David at the stronghold in the wilderness, mighty and experienced warriors, expert with shield and spear, whose faces were like the faces of lions and were swift as gazelles upon the mountains. There's little descriptions of what a lot of these tribes are like. And what we've learned is they're not all the same. One of the things that's noted about Benjamin, this isn't the only place, is that a lot of Benjaminites are left-handed, or at least can do things left-handed and right-handed. And so it was something that, seems to have been in their DNA. You get Gadites, who a lot of very fast people. And then it keeps mentioning little things like this about a bunch of these people that came to him. And it says in verse 16, some of the men of Benjamin and Judah came to the stronghold to David. David went out to meet them and said to them, if you have come to me in friendship to help me, my heart will be joined to you. But if to betray me to my adversaries, although there is no wrong in my hands, then may the God of our fathers see and rebuke you. And then we get the Spirit clothed Amasai, chief of the 30. He said, we are yours, O David, and with you, O son of Jesse. Peace to you, and peace to your helpers, for your God helps you. So you notice that even the Benjaminites, when Saul is ruling, there's a bunch of them who recognize that David is the chosen one that God has anointed to be king. And a lot of them, we were told when they first started coming to him in Samuel and Kings, they're listed as just a bunch of worthless fellows. So they're warriors. They are people who fight and kill. That's what they're good at. That doesn't make them necessarily, good at other things. Now, it keeps going on, and it lists a number of things. And then you have, so it lists in 19, some of the men of Manasseh deserted to David when he came with the Philistines for the battle against Saul. So when does that happen? Yeah, remember, that's the time where he was living down in Philistia, and the king of Philistia thought, David's on my side, and he called David to come fight with him, and all the rest of the lords of Philistia went, we don't want this guy. He's going to defect over to Saul's side as soon as, we come into battle. Who knows what David would have done? I don't know what he would have done. I don't think he would have actually attacked his own people. He had always avoided that. But he didn't have to. He was sent away. And during that, when he's sent away, is when he is able to go rescue his and all of his men's families who had been taken by the Amalekites. Now, and so you see that actually in this war, now it could be that, remember when Saul fought the Philistines? You remember, well, Saul died, obviously, because basically he got an arrow from probably some distance. It got him, and he was going to die. And Israel noticed they were going to lose, and they started fleeing. They started all kind of running away, and it might have been at that point when some of these went to David. Hard to say exactly, but it's in that time frame that a lot of them desert to David. So they had been part of Saul's armies. And now here in Chronicles, it does mention, yet he did not help them, talking about the Philistines. For the rulers of the Philistines took counsel and sent him away, saying, at peril to our heads, he will desert to his master Saul. And he went to Ziklag, and then he starts mentioning a whole bunch of more people that come to him. So David ends up raising a very large army. And one of the things, like we're reading, if you're following along in the daily readings right now, David is essentially conquering all the enemies around them. Once they have kind of, he's got Judah, then he's got Israel, and then they destroy Philistia, the Philistines' armies, and then, and then he just begins to conquer all of these peoples around them. And that is essentially what David does. And I mentioned it, I think, in today's reading, that in my little comment, that what David did by being a man of war, a man of blood, is he allowed his son Solomon to be a king of peace. David wasn't a king of peace. He was a king who went to war and who led God's armies against all their enemies. Solomon didn't have to do that. Solomon essentially rules an empire. It's not often identified, Israel, as an empire, especially in kind of historical accounts, because they don't. But when we read about Solomon, and I don't know if you read it through it, but when you go read the accounts of Solomon and all of the tribute people are bringing to him, why do other nations bring a king tribute? Which is another word for taxes, by the way, essentially. It could be like, we're giving you gifts. Yeah, don't kill us. Don't conquer us, huh?
They're trying to earn favor.
Yeah, so they actually are giving him lots of money on a regular basis. Solomon is taxing everybody. And this is actually one of the reasons why Israel was placed in a place that it could get wealthy, because it controlled the land bridge that connected the three continents. So Africa, to go to Asia, or to go to the European continent, you had to travel through the land bridge. There were very few people in this time frame who could travel by sea in far distances, only really the Phoenicians. And so everything came through Israel, which is why there's so many battles in this area. and not, every empire, Egypt. In fact, from Egypt, Babylon's, Assyrians, Greece, they never saw Israel and Jerusalem as the big prize. They just needed to conquer it so that they could be in control. Okay? Israel was never the big prize. It was like Egypt was the big prize, Babylon was the big prize, Greece was the big prize. And Israel was this little teeny kingdom that, from these empires' perspective, that basically sat in the middle of the drawbridge that allowed you to tax everybody who wanted to trade. So, I don't know. Hopefully that makes sense to you. Okay. Now, there's a couple other things I thought I would just kind of point out to you here, because we'll focus most of the time on chapter 13. But as it lists a lot of these, it kind of gives us descriptions of a lot of these tribes. Simeon in verse 24, mighty men of valor. You got the Levites, as mentioned with them. Even some from the house of Aaron, so even priests. Some of them are fighting men. And Benjaminites, kinsmen of Saul, 3,000, of whom the majority had, to that point, kept their allegiance to the house of Saul, which is a reference that until the majority of them did not defect to him before Saul died. Most of them came after, probably when Abner created the covenant of peace with David. But it mentions the half tribe of Manasseh, which is the tribe of Manasseh on the east side of the Jordan River. It says they were expressly named to come and make David king. Issachar, men who had understanding of the times to know what Israel ought to do. This is what I say, there's interesting. So why is Issachar labeled that way? Shouldn't they all have been people who knew what they should do based on the times they were living in? But it seems to imply that Issachar has some wisdom that maybe others don't. And so it kind of mentions a lot of the strengths of different groups here. It mentions Zebulun equipped for battle with all the weapons of war to help David with singleness of purpose. Kind of sounds like Marines. These guys got every battle thing necessary, and they have a single-minded purpose to kill and destroy. That's what makes me think of. And so it means something, right? Naphtali, men armed with shield and spear. Danites, it talks about Asher, Reubenites, the other half-tribe Manasseh. So it comes down. Let's see, I think that's probably the only things I wanted to point out. But and then as we get down here to the end, we're talking about all these men of war arrayed in battle order came to Hebron with a whole heart to make David king over all Israel. Likewise, all the rest of Israel were of a single mind to make David king. Well, what time is that? What time frame is that? So at the beginning of chapter 12, we went back all the way to a bunch of people coming to him at Ziklag, which could have been fairly, Saul was king for 40 years, and David, was on the run for a lot of years. And so we don't know how long, but it was a fairly long period of time that it was back to in verse 12. But now we've come, just in this one chapter, we've come all the way from the people coming to him in the wilderness now to them gathering together to make him king over all of Israel, which seems to come to that point at which Abner and he are making a covenant of peace. Okay, well, that's just kind of a fairly quick overview of that. But I wanted to highlight those little comments that give you just little bits of information, and who knows why they're there, but they are there a lot in kind of lists of names. There are little comments. So, okay, any thoughts or questions?
Could you actually go back to the first map you had up there?
Okay.
About how large of an area that is geographically?
So if you look at it this way, because this basically is south, heading towards Note is south.
Okay.
I don't really know why this particular map set I have. These maps are really nice, but you never really know where north and south are. they just kind of orient it any old way, and so you have to kind of orient yourself. That's probably not much bigger than the Treasure Valley, from Caldwell to Boise. I think from the kind of far end of Caldwell, far end of Boise, I think it's about 60 miles, if I remember right. And that's kind of what a lot of this is. It's not a very big area, no. It's one of the reasons why, well, I'll attack this next. So here's Megiddo, which is where Armageddon comes from. And one of the reasons that Megiddo is a famous place for battles is that it controls a pass through the mountains. Okay, and so there are two wide paths that armies can travel through Israel, because when you get past go this way going east, not much past this point here, you can't travel. That's all, that becomes the Arabian Peninsula, that big hunk of sand that was impassable, but I guess some tribes, some nomadic peoples, some nomadic Arab peoples actually did discover oases in the desert where there was water, and they knew how to get to them. But you know, you're walking on sand dunes. That would be really tricky, wouldn't it? You'd have to really, it's almost like, you know, on the water. If you can't see anything, and don't have any markers, you could get lost pretty easy and miss the oasis. And so I guess a handful of them could travel somewhat into the desert, but it wasn't travelable by armies and things. So that's why there is what's called the Way of the Sea that came down through here and then cut across and went down through Philistia towards Egypt. And then there was the King's Highway that came along the east side of the Dead Sea and then down and around over to Egypt. And by the way, that's the King's Highway is essentially how Israel came into the land of Palestine. That's what they would have traveled up and then come in. So those main roads were the roads that all the traveling from north and south occurred. I do actually have, we got to talk about this one actually. So this one's coming up in chapter 13 here. This is the ark. And so the tabernacle is up here in Gibeon. Kirjath Jearim is where the ark is. Now, ask the good question with those two bits of information. What's a really good question? Why are they not together? That's not a great, easily answered. There are probably little clues you can kind of go, but it's funny. The ark, you know, sometimes they try to take the ark out as kind of like it's going to go before us, and then we just kind of, well, we just leave it over here because nobody can touch it. Or remember, it had been in the Philistines' hands for a while, and then they had to get rid of it. I think that's actually how it ends up here at Kirjath Jearim. That's where it got left after the Philistines sent it back into Israel. We don't want this thing because it's killing everybody here. So the ark was a scary thing, not just to the Philistines. It was to the Israelites as well, and it's emphasized again here when Uzzah touches it. So. But this is the tabernacle's here. Kirjath Jearim is where the ark is, and then this is the travel they're doing to Jerusalem, where probably somewhere maybe here that Uzzah touches it. And then it ends up in the house of Obed-Edom. And it stays there for a few months before they finally bring it back. Anybody remember what I commented on that in the Samuel readings? Why did David seem to finally bring it to Jerusalem? What was David told right before he brought it to Jerusalem?
Their house was blessed.
He's like, oh yeah, they're being blessed beyond measure. Essentially, like, oh, we got to get that thing up here. And it tells us this. This is one of the places in Chronicles. It doesn't give us a much different account than occurs in Samuel and Kings. So we'll pick it up here in chapter 13. David consulted with the commanders of thousands and of hundreds, with every leader. And David said to all the assembly of Israel, if it seems good to you and from the Lord our God, let us send abroad to our brothers who remain in all the lands of Israel, as well as to the priests and Levites in the cities that have pasture lands, that they may be gathered to us. Then let us bring again the ark of our God to us, for we did not seek it in the days of Saul. All the assembly agreed to do so, for the thing was right in the eyes of all the people. Now, this is the one comment that is different than in Samuel and Kings. Samuel and Kings doesn't mention this, but notice at David's comment, they were not seeking. Now, the thing about we're not seeking it, it could be him, not it. But where the ark was symbolic of that's where God's throne was. So that's where God was dwelling, or supposed to be dwelling, supposed to be sitting on that throne. And so they were not seeking him during the days of Saul. Now that's actually quite a commentary as well on on Saul and his kingdom. No. Any thoughts about that?
Not about that specifically. I was wondering, does it say if when the ark was moved from Obed-Edom to Jerusalem, if it was moved the correct way?
Yes, it is. Yeah, it actually, this number here, I can't remember the passage, but it tells us they basically then learn the proper way, and the Levites come with the poles, and because the ark was supposed to be carried. One supposed to be on a cart, being pulled by oxen, but that's how that had come to them. Because remember, the Philistines had stuck it on an ark with essentially oxen who had never pulled a cart. Okay, they yoked them up, put them on there, and said, well, if it goes where it's supposed to go, then we'll know it's from the hand of God, because they've never pulled a cart before, and they're all worked together and pulled the cart there. Pulled the cart and the ark and everything. And so they seem to have lost the kind of institutional knowledge of how to actually move the things according to God's plan. And so here they eventually do. The Levites get the poles, put it in. So if you were here and watched all the kids, take the poles of gold and, move the ark around, you'd have an idea. Everybody, who missed that Saturday? Who saw it? Oh yeah. Yeah. Dangerous. The walls came tumbling down. Oh yeah. This is just another little clue about what was wrong with Saul. Because don't you sometimes think, well, why did Saul lose his entire kingdom just because of that one time he, offered sacrifices before Samuel could get there? Doesn't it almost seem a little small? Oh, there's a lot of sins people do. David does a bunch of sins that seem like, right, yes. Huh? Why is he chosen in the first place? This is just my judgment. This is one of those things that I think God tends to give nations the rulers they deserve, rather than the rulers that are after his own heart. Yes, I think they got Saul, and they liked Saul. He was tall, so he probably, if the average man said he was a head taller than essentially the other men, and I think they averaged 5'6", 5'8", Israelite men. So he's into 6 foot, pretty good. That would be really tall, and he said he was good looking, he was tall, but he actually was, internally, he was not strong. David probably wasn't big and tall. Now, he does say David was really handsome, but I think, where does it mention? I don't think there's a sense that he's probably not very big. But David has a really strong faith, and he stands up to his men and does the right thing, regardless of the number of people who are trying to, force something or tell him to do something. Where Saul was always afraid and acting in fear. And so he had a very weak nature, even though he looked big and strong and handsome. And I think there was partially a lesson for Israel, though, too. And because that's actually the lesson he teaches Samuel when Samuel goes through all of David's older brothers, and they're like, well, it's none of these. And don't you have any others? And he's like, well, yeah, but I got that teenager out there with the sheep. And so bring him too. I mean, his dad didn't even want to bring David. They think, well, it can't be him that has been chosen to be king. His own dad thought that. So, and God made the point to Samuel, I don't see like you see. Because even Samuel thought when he saw the oldest son of Jesse, he thought, oh, must be him, big, strong. Nope. This is weird. That little kid? No. Yeah, and I think there was obviously a lesson in there with Saul as well. Any other thoughts? This is just one of those little things that it tells us something about 40 years of Saul who really didn't care about God's tabernacle, his ark, seeking God's advice and wisdom, and it tells you what he was like. Yeah. Yeah.
And just pass the kingdom on.
Right.
More peaceful life.
Yeah. If you've been keeping up with the daily readings, have you noticed, I keep mentioning how often we learn that people knew David was chosen to be king. And they fought him. They fought God's will. Abner seems like a good guy. Seems like a better guy, by the way, than David's own commander, Joab. But Abner was fighting the will of God for 7.5 years. And so, and even the people of Israel knew it too. So there was, and why the animosity toward David when they knew God had chosen him? They all rallied behind Saul, who was not good. What was that? He probably was, yeah. Saul was manipulative. He could manipulate Saul for sure. But David, there also seems to be some kind of contention between the tribes, some kind of contention between Judah and the others. Yeah. Okay. So all the assembly agreed, yes, we need to bring the ark to Jerusalem, for the thing was right in the eyes of all the people. Now this might also help us, this little map, I think might help us understand why David wants to build him a house in Jerusalem. Because it never mentions the tabernacle being moved. It mentions the ark being brought. Now, is it moved to Jerusalem? Maybe. But I don't remember any place it's mentioned. It's like the tabernacle seems to just lose its significance.
Doesn't it say that it was in a tent when David wants to do it? God says no, but
He says he was wandering about in a tent. So, because David's like, I want to build you a house. He goes like, I've been in a tent, wandering around with you people. I've never asked you for a house. But I wonder if I just wonder if he wanted to do that. Where is the ark? Did they move the tabernacle? It just doesn't say. Maybe. Well, it could be an inference. I don't think it'd be necessary. Yeah.
But it does say tent.
Yes. No, he had wandered around the tent, which the term tabernacle is tent. So, yeah. All right. Anybody? You remember someplace?
Maybe it's like when you have your own tent at home and you use the poles.
Yeah.
That's a lot of pieces to move around.
And the tabernacle had to be moved properly too. There were Levites who were tasked with that job, to know how to do it, how to take it apart, how to put it back up. No, and for all of the hundreds of years, have they been maintaining it? Have they been like fixing all of the tent panels? You ever notice though how little the tabernacle is actually talked about? It's one of those interesting things, we don't think about it a lot, but the tabernacle and even the ark sometimes, until the temple is built, for a fairly long period in there after the wanderings, there's not a lot mentioned about it.
Which is crazy because it's mentioned in such detail.
Yes.
It's being built
Right.
and designed
Yeah.
and created, that it's intricate and beautiful.
Yes.
And costly.
And it's the center of all, they all camp around it. And then even when they first came into the land, remember it took them a fairly long time to spread out. It seems like it was in Gibeah. Anyway, it seems like at first, let me go back here. It seems like somewhere, I'm trying to remember now, is it Shechem? Anyway, so it actually is in the tabernacle, the ark, everything is set up, and they were in, all of Israel was living in one area near the tabernacle for a while. And then they began to go to their properties. And then it does seems like that it loses some significance. It begins to be less and less talked about, especially during the time of Saul. So, okay. Did you find something that mentions it? Hey, something?
Well, after they're singing praises and everything, and it starts to talk about, I'm jumping way ahead. You want me to go there?
Are you talking about in chapter 13 here?
No, 16.
Oh, in chapter 16?
In chapter 16, at verse,
Oh, okay. Where they bring a tent? Okay.
it says tabernacle here.
Yeah.
My translation says
Tent, tabernacle, they both mean the same thing.
Right. But it says in the high place that was at Gibeon.
Okay.
We got to Zadok, the priest, and his brothers.
And set it inside the tent they had pitched for it. They brought it in, and they brought in the ark of God and set it inside the tent that David had pitched for it. And it says, did you say there was a place where it mentions they left the other one?
Maybe he left a priest and his brothers
Which verse you at?
before the tabernacle, that's 39.
In verse
Before the
16?
tabernacle of the Lord in the high place that was at Gibeon.
Okay.
To offer burnt offerings to the Lord on the altar of burnt offering.
Okay. So in Gibeon then, in Gibeon the tabernacle was left. So David built a new tent in Jerusalem for it. Which seems a little weird, right? Because all of the images of the tabernacle and the temple are these two rooms with the ark in the Holy of Holies. And they haven't been together for a long time. So, oh yeah. No, thanks for that. Okay. So everybody knows the story of Uzzah and the ark? Huh? Pretty much. It's kind of one of the famous ones, Uzzah doesn't appear, maybe he doesn't have the right attitude about touching it, but basically God is like, I told you you can't touch it. And so sometimes there's consequences in making a point. Right?
I have a question regarding that then.
Okay?
Because we discussed earlier about how the ark was supposed to be transported, it was supposed to be carried, right?
Mm-hmm.
And in my translation, it says, Uzzah had reached out to hold the ark because the cattle had stumbled, which means the ark is being carried by cattle in this.
Yeah, it's on a cart, and they had stumbled, and he's afraid that it might come off. It seems like, and so he's like steadying it. It appears.
Maybe God was a little bit irritated already. He might have been a little bit angry with the situation. As he
Sure,
was being carried.
I would assume so. This reminds me a little bit of God being upset with Israel when they went to battle at Ai, and just a handful of people at Ai killed like 3,000 of them. And they're like, what wrong? And he's like, you guys need to deal with your sin. Oh, okay. Now you should now after they deal with it, they say, okay, you should listen to me and do what I say. So I think Uzzah is a little bit like an example of Aaron's sons, Nadab and Abihu, right? They became examples, just like the people that lied to the Holy Spirit and to the apostles about how much money they're giving there in Acts 5, huh? Yeah, I'm trying to remember their names. Oh, somebody said it. Okay, Ananias and Sapphira. I mean, again, it seems like a pretty minor thing, and other people have done worse stuff, right, and not been killed right away. But again, that was at the beginning of the church, and God made a point to the church. He taught them a lesson, and sometimes we are the people who get the lesson so others can learn from it. And I think that's somewhat going on here with Uzzah. But yeah, I mean, so they made all of this big to-do about gathering to do all this, but they never actually checked about how to do it. And Uzzah is the one who suffered the consequences for all of them. But I really think it is an interesting comment here about where David, when it happens, that Uzzah, touched it, and the anger of the Lord was kindled against Uzzah, and he struck him down because he put his hand to the ark, and he died there before God. David was angry because the Lord had broken out against Uzzah, and that place is called Perez Uzzah to this day. David was afraid of God that day and said, "How can I bring the ark of God home to me?" That's not actually an attitude you typically hear with David, is it? But is David being afraid of God a lesson for David still? What do you think?
They thought they were doing a good thing, and they thought, and I'm thinking David was excited and happy. I mean, they got a new cart. The archives,
Well,
not just any old ox cart.
And they were dancing like crazy
So
as
they're,
they're doing.
they're excited about it, and then all of a sudden that happens, and it just kind of kills the party right there.
Mm-hmm.
And so there would be fear, because they're going, what, did they not know, really?
Right.
Or did it get lost in, the years where they weren't
No.
wandering, they lost that knowledge or something, and then, so they don't know how anymore? They have to go back and do what is acceptable in God's sight,
Right.
which is in Hebrews. I think about that a lot, like, we don't worship just any old way.
Mhm.
We worship what is in a way that is acceptable to God. And this was not acceptable to God.
Right.
It seems little to us, but it wasn't.
Right. Because I think it's actually an important lesson to remember to fear the Lord. I know sometimes we do point out that to fear the Lord has a concept in it of respect. But one of the aspects of respect is that you respect how powerful he is and that he can kill you in an instant. He is that powerful. And having that proper fear, because what did Moses do when he's like striking the rock and why are we, and God and I have to put up with you, and what happened to Moses? You don't get to go into the promised land, Moses. I didn't tell you to do that.
Which seems like a little thing.
It does seem like a little thing, but it was a lesson. And you see these lessons fairly regular because like Moses, who got a little too, hey, why are God and I having to do this for you? And
Like when you go spank your kid, wind up getting a blood blister or a blood. I mean, I don't know if you've ever.
I've never
I've
happened to me.
spanked so hard enough to do that. Never mind that, not-
Okay. Sorry to say I haven't had that experience, but we can ask your kids. But, I mean, I do think this is something, I've had this conversation going long back because I've known brethren who have kind of like, they really hate the idea of having to be afraid of God, our Father. And the people have talked about this had a father who was a pretty tyrannical person, and so they didn't like that, to think about God like their father. But sometimes I think we can pretty easily get a little too familiar with God. Have you heard people praying about like, hey dude, or they get real like he's your buddy, like trying to get rid of formalities and things, which sometimes get in the way, but sometimes we forget we're not like God. God is different than us. Someday we will be like him, but we're not like him right now. And he is not a respecter of persons. So even though I have been really good and I've been like, if I've been good, Moses, David, or whatever, but he can still get angry at me too, no matter what we've done. Just like, he did with lots of his, even Peter, being corrected. So, okay, we'll leave it there. We'll pick it up next week, probably 14, 15. You got the invitation, you're singing. Closing prayer. Okay, let's turn it over.
No reason to wait since Dave's not here to slow everything down.
I took the extra minute.
That's fine. Let's sing 797. $797. Basses and sopranos, so alto, so E tenor, so. Lord, we come before thee now, at thy feet we humbly bow. Oh, do not us to disdain. Shall we seek thee, Lord, in vain? Shall we seek thee, Lord, in vain? Lord, of thee our announcements, we'll sing 537. 537.
Good to see everyone here tonight. all half dozen of us. No, it's good to see everyone. We've had a lot of sickness kind of go through our group here. Dave is sick and Debbie's home with him. Audrey and Morgan are sick. Hastings are sick. Jerry Neilbeck tested positive for COVID, so they all stayed home. Fraley's are staying home. Zoe is sick and Chelsea's home with her. Jordan's not feeling well. Those that are a little more serious than the colds and that type of sickness. Mike's mom had a heart attack last night. She seems to be doing well. They're planning to discharge her either Thursday or Friday. So want to remember her. She's having some struggles, and so we want to remember her. James Harris, who's been visiting from Phoenix, he got a call this morning that his mom was taken to ER. So seems to be complications from an outpatient surgery that was yesterday. So want to remember her in our prayers. Roger, who's been visiting with us for some time, is going in for surgery the 9th of August. He does have a 2-week quarantine period before that. So he's getting ready for that surgery. So hopefully he can get some relief from for his back from that surgery. And as we announced Sunday, Dave's mom had a hip replacement, so she's recovering from that. And then Dave's niece Sadie Papica was diagnosed with breast cancer, so I want to remember her as well, and her and her family in our prayers. So long list, lots of people needing to be remembered. This evening I would like to take a few minutes. I know that Roger's been in Chronicles, and as he mentioned, those first 9 chapters, those dry chapters of all those names, I want to go into chapter 4. Now, remember, Roger said that within these long lists of names and whoever begat whoever, and so all those names, in 1 Chronicles chapter 4, there's in verse 9, there's someone mentioned by the name of Jabez. It says Jabez was more honorable than his brothers. Who's Jabez? Well, Jabez was someone from, I'm assuming from the tribe of Judah, since that's in the same lineage there. But it says that he was more honorable than his brothers, and his mother called his name Jabez, saying, because I bore him in pain. Now, last I heard, labor's kind of intense for most everything, so I'm not sure if that's what makes him special. He was born in pain. But this is why he was. In verse 10 it says, Jabez called upon the God of Israel. So what does that mean, that he called upon the God of Israel? Doesn't that mean that he prayed? He reached out to God. Well, let's see what he said. He says, oh, that you would bless me and enlarge my border, and that your hand might be with me, and that you would keep me from harm, so that it might not bring me pain. What a simple request. But yet we see that he was more honorable. Was he more honorable because he took the time to approach God? That he took the time to spend time with God? The prayer's pretty straightforward. Bless me, enlarge my border, have your hand be with me. I mean, isn't that what we want from God as well? And that you would keep me from harm, so that it might not bring me pain. What a simple prayer. But look how it ends. And God granted what he asked. What a simple lesson. Go to God. Talk to him. Ask of him. And he too might grant you what you ask. So That's the short message I have for this evening. I think our announcements were longer than the actual talk, but if you have a need, please let it be known as together we stand and sing this closing song.
Here we are, but straying pilgrims here. Our path is often dim, but to cheer us on our journey still, we sing this wayside hymn. Yonder over the rolling river, where the shining mansions rise, soon will be our homes forever, and the smile of the blessed giver gladens all our longing eyes. Here our feet are often weary on the hills that throng our way. Here the tempest darkly gathers, but our hearts within us say, yonder over the rolling river, where the shining mansions rise, soon will be our homes forever, and the smile of the blessed giver gladens all our longing eyes. Here our souls are often fearful of the pilgrim's lurking foe, but the Lord is our defender, and He tells us we may know. Yonder over the rolling river, where the shining mansions rise, soon will be our homes forever, and the smile of the blessed giver gladens all our longing eyes. We'll have a closing prayer.
Gotta admit, it's a little nerve-wracking, being in front of so many people. Let us pray. Our Father in heaven, we come before Thee tonight to say thank you for allowing us to be here and worship You in peace. Thank you to Roger for the lessons he provides to allow us to help understand Your word better. Please be with those who are sick tonight, those who are dealing with things like colds and COVID, and also those who are getting prepared or recovering from surgeries and more ailments that are tough to deal with. Please be with us as we travel home tonight, that we make it home safely and no ill befalls us. And thank You so much, most of all, for Your Son who died on the cross to save us and allow us to look forward to a life with You. And we say these things in His name. Amen.